Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu, all learners. This is again teacher Muhyiddin Khalif. Today we will be looking at lesson 4 of genetics, and that is about the genes and the DNA. The genes and the DNA. Today we will be navigating through the gene and the DNA. And in the next lesson we will be discussing about the DNA replication, the double helix and all those. But today we will be much discussing about the genes and the DNA. Actually, it should be the genes. It should be the genes and the DNA. The genes and the DNA. Now, to start with, what is a gene? Because that is what we are starting with today, gene. Genes. Now, as we have discussed earlier, that the genes are hereditary materials. That the genes are hereditary materials that are transmitted from the parents to the offspring. We say genes are hereditary materials. These are hereditary materials that are transmitted. From the parents to the offsprings. As you all know, learners, in the first lesson of this chapter, we discussed about the commonly used terms in genetics, and one among the commonly used terms in genetics was the gene. And you say the gene, these are hereditary materials that are transmitted from the parents to the offspring, right? Because you know that the genes are the structures which carry the characteristics of the organisms. And therefore, and the genes in the human body or in the reproductive organs, they exist in pair. And a pair of a gene is called what we call the genotype. For instance, TT, homozygous TT, as a genotype. And therefore, a gene is that hereditary structures or other materials that are transmitted from parents to offspring. Now, what is the relationship between a gene and a DNA? That is what we want to discuss again in this one. Now, we say a gene is a short portion of the DNA molecule. Very good. A gene is a short portion of a DNA molecule. A gene is a short portion of a DNA molecule. Again, the gene being a short portion of a DNA molecule, again, where is very important, we know the nature of this gene. We say a gene is a short portion of a DNA molecule that is chemical in nature. That is chemical. That is chemical in nature. Very good. You see, a gene is a short portion of a DNA that is chemical in DNA. Now, let's look between a gene and a DNA. What is a gene and what is a DNA? Very good. Now, class, we said the genes are hereditary materials, right? And we said the genes is a short portion of a DNA molecule. Now, let's look at this. I want to emphasize the DNA as well as the gene. They are distinguishing. Now, the DNA is like this instruction manual that is long and contains instructions for every characteristics. It codes for characteristics of every instruction. For instance, the characteristics for hair structure, skin color, height, all those are contained in the long molecule of a DNA strand, of a DNA. And therefore, a particular characteristic, for example, that of the skin, hair texture, now is what you call a gene, for instance. Let's look, the DNA molecule, we say, is the instruction manual that codes, for instance, as an example, a DNA is that the instruction manual that codes for many that contains instructions or codes for many characteristics. And therefore, we say the gene again is the chapters in a DNA. The genes again are the chapters in a DNA. For instance, a DNA molecule may contain the genes for skin color, hair texture, for instance, the blood groups. It also contains the height. All those are contained in the DNA molecule. But first it comes for a gene is either for the gene for tallness, one, either for the gene of shortness, or rather, again the gene can also be the gene for a skin color, certain skin color. Now, very good. That is about the gene and the DNA relationship. And you see, the DNA is like the long, is a instruction manual in a long molecule that contains instruction or other codes for various characteristics or like that. Well, the gene, I would say, are the chapters in a DNA molecule, Now, class, sometimes you can say DNA determines the characteristics of an organism. DNA, a gene, no, I mean the gene, gene determines the characteristics of an organism. The characteristics of an organism. Very good. A gene determines the characteristics of an organism. A gene determines the characteristics of organism. How? How can a gene, class, determine the characteristics of an organism? For instance, class, what we know is that the gene codes for a specific protein. Each and every gene codes for a specific protein. How can it code for a specific protein? What it does is it specifies the order, or the codes. It also specifies the order in which the amino acids are linked together. Very good. We say genes determine the characteristics of an organism. How? The genes, they determine, or rather they specify the proteins. Now, how can they specify the proteins? By specifying the order in which the amino acids are linked together. Very good. That is it. Now we say the gene determines the characteristics of an organism. How? The gene determines the specific protein for a particular trait. How? It specifies the order in which the amino acids are linked together to form that particular protein. And each and every protein codes for a particular characteristics. And that is it. Now let's come to, again, the next portion of the DNA. The DNA. The DNA, we say, is a complex molecule composed of 3 different components. The DNA is a complex molecule composed of 3 different components. That is 5 carbon sugar. Number 1, 5 carbon sugar. Phosphate molecule. Number 3, nitrogenous bases. And we say the DNA is a complex molecule composed of 3 different components. That is 5 carbon sugar, the phosphate molecule, and the nitrogenous bases. Now, let's look at the nitrogenous bases. What is the composition of the nitrogenous bases? Nitrogenous bases. Very good. Now, in the nitrogenous bases, we have 4 in the nitrogenous bases that makes up the nitrogenous bases for protein. Very good. Number 1, we have the adenine. A. You have 2, Roman 2, you have the thymine, in bracket T. Roman 3, you have the guanine. This G, and lastly you have cytosine, C. Now, Class, we said the nitrogenous species are composed of the adenine, the guanine, thymine, and the cytosine. Again, class, a combination of the three molecules, a combination of three components forms the nucleotide. We have something called the nucleotide. A combination of the three components, we say the combination of these three components, they form something called the nucleotide. A combination of the three components of a DNA, they form the nucleotide. They form the nucleotides. Again, we say we have something called DNA strand. DNA strand. DNA strand. DNA strand. DNA strand. Class, what do we mean by saying the DNA strand? A DNA strand is a combination of several nucleotides joined together. We say DNA strand consists of several nucleotides joined together. Is several nucleotides joined together. Now, when several nucleotides are joined together, it's the several nucleotides joined together forming long chains. Forming long chains. Several nucleotides joined together forming long chains is what is called the DNA strand. The DNA strand. Because we are going to see along the length of a DNA strand, we have the following proteins. We have the adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And there's a way these four proteins, again, they are going to pair with one. That's what we're trying is of several DNA. DNA. We have DNA twist on the double helix. Is parallel one another. Very good. Now a double helix twist strand join together chain, right? Structures in our next lesson. But for now, let's get the basis. Because this is now in other they make us is that we have the adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. They are quantities which to be is equal. For the quantities are and thymine are of equal quantities. They are going to pair. Guanine quantities is on adenine pair. G at amine with guanine, and therefore this is in essence we are about, and therefore we say that a DNA of side and DNA is a section of the DNA chromosome. A gene is the chromosome on the chromosome. A division of that specific a gene is a section chromosome consists of DNA. Application of the thank you very with you here come to become